So I'm presenting slightly more early stage work, so please bear with me. But after I collect feedback and gripes and complaints from this group and I'm able to address that, I'll feel much better about fielding these studies actually in the real world. So this project that I'm going to share with you today basically explores the relationship between foreign competition and people's attitudes towards workplace technology. And so technology, as we know, has both positive and sort of negative impacts on workers. So workers can think about technology as either their ally or their enemy. The enemy narrative, I'm sure that many of you are aware of. If you open a newspaper and read some more of the doomsday sort of interpretation of technology, whether technology will take away people's jobs, whether it hurt their salaries, that's essentially the sort of the enemy narrative, and people can totally buy into that. But at the same time, workers can also think about technology as something that's helping them. That's their ally, their friend. And if we actually revisit works that are done in social sciences 30, 40 years ago, you actually see that narrative a little bit more prominent than today. So for example, Ruth Milkman's work, I think she's a sociologist, in the 90s, when she talked to American auto workers actually talk about technology as a form of necessary evil. It's like, we don't love the technology we're using, but without them, we'll be in a much worse spot. So this sentiment, shows that they actually think about technology not entirely in a negative light. The same with Kathleen Thaylen's work on German manufacturing. German manufacturers also saw that, technology is being helpful to them, and they describe technology as fundamentally, they're fundamentally receptive to technological change. I have some sort of newer work that I went and did with my co-authors in Chinese factories, and essentially we talked to Chinese factory workers. So this orange robotic arm is doing exactly what you're doing now. Are you worried about it? And shocking to me, many people actually told me that they're not so worried about it. And the reason for not being so worried is that they're saying that if we don't automate, the likes of Cambodia, Indonesia, so these lower wage countries, their factories will automate, and so we'll be left behind. And so this really highlights the idea that not every single worker think about technology just in this sort of the enemy sense. Sometimes we think about technology positively. And so this paper is essentially to think about what's the relationship between sort of what workers' perception of technology is and foreign technology, and foreign competition. And what essentially I'm arguing here is that technology's role as an enemy or ally really depends on the level of competition that's faced by workers. And so the question is, why might foreign competition increase tolerance for labor replacing technology? And so to borrow from the international political economy framework, we can think about it in a more self-interested, cost-benefit, egoistic way. Is that workers who are being exposed to trade, like the Chinese manufacturing story that I just told you, these workers think about technology is something that might potentially threaten their job, but at the same time, these are also tools that can help them outcompete foreign workers. On the flip side, for workers who are not exposed to trade, for example, these are truck drivers. They are not really exposed to competition from truck drivers in China. They are actively quite against self-driving trucks. And so what I'm saying here is that workers who are not exposed to trade might just more primarily feel that technology threatens their jobs, and technology on its own doesn't really help them that much at all. But that's only one way of thinking about foreign competition. We can also think about foreign competition in a geopolitical sense, in a more sociotropic manner, is that workers can be interested in sort of their country's standing in the world. So for example, whether China is winning or whether the US is winning. And so if we look at nationally representative surveys in the United States, we actually do find that over 90% of Americans believe that investing in STEM, it's really important for the US to remain competitive in relation to other countries in the global economy. And technology has always been really instrumental in geopolitical competition. You see that language in CHIPS Act. You even see that language during the Cold War. Sending people to outside the Earth is very costly, but we do it because we want to win. And so just to more formalize my expectations a little bit, what I expect to see is that foreign competition might increase more pro-technology attitudes and make people make people less protectionist against policy, against technology, and want the government to be less interventionist in that space, such that technology can flourish. And just to, again, make it more clear, I argue that there might be a self-interested way of thinking about it. And so what I hypothesize is that individuals who are trade exposed, who are working in tradable industries, are more likely to be tolerant of new workplace technology and are less likely to prefer government action to slow down automation. H1B is just a subjective formulation of that, is that instead of looking whether people are in tradable industries, I ask them how much competition do you think your industry is facing. For H2, what I say here is that individuals who feel a higher sense of competition between countries, and in this specific context, I'm studying American workers, so competition between US and China specifically will make them more tolerant of new workplace technology and make them less likely to prefer the government to do anything to intervene and slow down automation. And just to remind you, I'm presenting work that's at the pilot stage. So I did do an observational survey first, and I followed that up with a survey experiment. So first talk about the observational survey. Again, it's a pilot, so I only have about 500 participants, so I will not quote myself on this, but I think that by going through this, I'll get good feedback from this crowd. And so what I did at the very beginning is to sort of define the scope of technological change, because this is such a broad topic, as evidenced by the sort of broad papers that we see in the next few days. But here what I define, I try to narrow down what people think about technology, is that I ask people to think about the phenomenon where companies are increasingly adopting new technologies like machine and software that can automate certain tasks. So when people think about technology, they're thinking about these very specifics of workplace technology that have labor replacing possibilities. For the independent variables, I measure essentially foreign competition. And I have a tradability dummy, people's subjective beliefs about how much competition they're actually facing, and their beliefs about the role of technology on US standing in the world. For the outcome variables, dependent variables, I have a series of attitudes, so whether they support or oppose firms adopting new technology, whether they support or oppose government action to speed up or slow down automation. As for policies, I measure things like robot tax, that's been talked at least a little bit in the media, and things like financial aid to workers. I also included a set of measures for individual action. So I think there's always some doubts as to whether we actually discuss policy-related technology-related policies that much, but that individual level action are things that actually people can do in response to automation. And so whether they would like to participate in retraining is something that I measure. Okay, so what I find here, again, using this pilot, is that I find support for the second hypothesis, is that people believe that technology improves the global standing of the United States relative to other foreign competitors, are more supportive of workplace technological change. They're less likely to oppose firms adopting new technology, and they're more likely to prefer the government to do something to speed up the speed of automation. Interestingly, there is no statistically significant effect on redistributive policy preferences. So in some ways, I was able to see a relationship between people's attitudes and what they think about technology, but not on redistributive policies per se. And perhaps that's not entirely surprising, given the political conversations that we have now, is that we don't really talk that much about technology-related policies as it pertains to workers. And again, on other sets of behavior and responses, for people who believe that technology is good for US standing, they are more likely to support less protectionist individual level measures like getting retraining in response to automation. International economic threat, which is my first hypothesis, I actually don't find them to be very predictive of technology attitudes, and likewise, they are not really that predictive of policy preferences either. And so essentially what I find from the observational study is that I didn't find much of the evidence to support the first hypothesis. I did find some support for the second hypothesis, which is to think about geopolitical competition as a motivating factor for why people support or oppose automation. But then you might be like, okay, an observational study, if you have a good sample, which I did not have just now, would provide good descriptive information, but then we're still in this correlational space. And so what I propose to do next is to use an experiment to directly manipulate the sense of geopolitical competition so as to strengthen our ability to make a causal inference here. And so this survey experiment is relatively simple in design, and so I just basically split up the sample into 50%, 50%. The first 50% in the control group, they don't receive any questions about competition. But for the 50% who are in the competition treatment group, what I additionally showed them is a question that asked them to directly think about US-China competition. So I say that there's this recent report by this Australian think tank that these are all factual stuff that's from the think tank's report. And I asked them, so which country do you think will lead in the technology race 10 years from now? Do you think it's the United States, China, another country? And so basically people who are in the treated condition had to think about competition. People who are not in the people who are in the control condition weren't invited to think about that. And for outcome variables, essentially the same sort of outcome variables that you saw in the observational study. I fielded this on Prolific for the time being, and this is what I find. So I don't know if people are able to see it very clearly. So this side is the control condition. This side is the treated condition. And what you see here, firstly, is that respondents were primed to think about competition. People will answer that question about whether the US or China will win, are less likely to prefer government action to slow down automation. So that's consistent with what I hypothesized before. But again, very, very interestingly, is that even they had that attitudinal change. This does not correspond to changing policy preferences. It's that they feel like, automation should not be slowed down, but at the same time, they don't update what they think the government should do in terms of policies. That also does not really change what they think they should do personally. For example, seeking retraining. I don't observe a difference between the treated and control condition. So currently, this is now not in the causal inference world, but I thought that was interesting, is that I actually find larger treatment effects among people who believe the US will win. So this is analysis of people who are in the treated condition, who are asked that question whether they think China or the US or other country will win. And people will answer that they think that the US will win. We see that there are more, even more pro-technology, is that they think about the competition, they think the US will win, and so they double down and think that, okay, we should do more and to really speed up technological change in the United States. And so to conclude, using these pilot studies, I find that perceptions of global competition seem to shape technology attitudes. And this changing support is shaped by perceptions of global competition, and that I don't find that strong of a support of this, egoistic cost-benefit type analysis. And instead, I find that it's the sociotropic concerns that people's concern about where the US stands relative to other countries, and particularly China, really shapes how they feel the US should proceed in terms of technology. The next steps is to, of course, collect better samples in the US, again, after collecting complaints from this group. And I also plan to run sort of companion studies in China, because actually at the end of the day, I derived these sets of hypotheses from doing field work in China. So I'm eager to do a mirror study in China so that I can tell a more complete and fuller story about this. So thank you very much.
I'll start on this side. Victor, do you want to go?
Yeah, you might well, let's wait. One suggestion for future surveys or whatnot is to think about the distributional conflict within the supply chain for export sensitive areas or export exposed areas. So a good example I would say is something like semiconductors. If you think about the winners in the United States, it would be folks working on the intellectual property or the design of the chips. So NVIDIA or Qualcomm or ARM, you know, it's not an American company, but it has exposure to the US, versus, let's say, at Intel, if you're working at a plant in Oregon, pretty much Taiwan has eaten your lunch and you're rent-seeking to see if you can survive at this point. They might be delisted from the Dow Jones because they're doing so poorly, because they're so exposed on the production side, whereas Taiwan's comparative advantage is obviously in producing the chips for those folks in the US that design them. So if I were to write a survey question about this, I would want to know, or at least prime folks to know, where they are in that supply chain. And I think you might find results that are more amenable to your priors, given that you yourself admitted it's a very coarse dummy measure, whatnot. So I think the supply chain for actual products and the intangible capital part of it versus downstream production could help kind of tease out those expected effects.
Thank you. So let's collect a few more. Italo?
So, Nicole, I find the whole idea that the extent of competition you're exposed to could be an important determinant very fascinating, and I think there's a lot of value in that. I was thinking maybe the reason why you don't find an effect of that is that probably, okay, on the one hand, if I'm under a lot of competition, I may think this is going to help us face this competition. On the other hand, I may also think, okay, we're already under trade competition, let's not be in competition also with robots or whatever, or the technology. So you could justify with this, let's say, counter argument. But still, I think in the way you're testing it, maybe something you could try is looking at competition separately. Because, you know, for nationalism, you include it as a single variable. But then you include competition only when you're already controlling for nationalism, if I understand it well. And I think that could be problematic. I mean, going back to what Valentina was discussing before, I'm curious to see if you regress nationalism on exposure to competition, maybe you find out that nationalism is already an outcome of exposure to competition. So if you just test for them at the same time, you're not able to retrieve an effect of competition because, you know, nationalism is already post-treatment. That's something I will definitely try, but I think the idea is very fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. One more. Oh, I think we have one here. Sorry. Or did you have a question too?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a complaint. No, I'm just kidding. So I was just thinking about your survey experiment that you're doing in a question, the treatment gets a question, and the control gets no question. But then the treatment is whatever is in that question, right? And so what you want is to think about, like, what's the construct that you're, that is the causal treatment, right? And so one thought I had is maybe it might trigger like emotions, anxiety or something in addition to the framing effects. You might just think about, like, within that prompt, what are the possible causes that could be kind of captured by that question, and then pair it with questions that do the other kind of confounding things that might be in the question. That's all. Yeah, thanks.
Steve Wayne with Georgetown. So I've seen this paper now before, but I have new thoughts on it. So I'd like you to unpack, try to understand better who these folks are that are concerned about maintaining U.S. competitiveness. I think, building on really on the first question here, looking to underlying features that might be predictive of that concern and that consideration. And perhaps the literature on distributional consequences of trades winners and losers can can shed light on that. And so you're making a case that this is kind of a sociotropic attitude, that you're concerned about U.S. advantage, but that might, the response to that question might just be proxying for whether or not you see yourself as a winner in globalization. And so thinking about, the different sectors in the United States where the United States has a comparative advantage, but especially in like high-skilled tradable services versus other industries, lower-skilled manufacturing, where those folks have not won out, could shed light, I think, on some of that response and that attitude towards maintaining international competitiveness in ways that could be illuminating.
Let's give Nicole a chance to answer.
So thank you, everyone. I already marked down a bunch of actionable things I can do after I go home. I guess I'll sort of go one by one. So for the first one, I do really agree with you, is that I don't find support for H1. There are multiple reasons, could be multiple reasons. One is that the effect is not there. The second is that it's just too crude. And so I think like Steve's suggestion and the first one really invites me to go back and think more deeply about H1 is why didn't I see an effect? And I'll do, and I'll consider sort of firms, people's sort of relationship, people's position in the supply chain. That's very interesting because I do have other work that looks at the size of firms that people are working in. So we can think about big firms as people working in big firms are benefiting from globalization. So far, we don't really we still find no effects there. But then this conversation really invites me to again revisit that, and that's very important. So the second comment, I would try to do different model specifications. I think that point I should really take into account. And so for the treatment. It's really helpful that you mentioned it, because I've not actually done the real thing yet, so there's really a lot of opportunities for me to change it. And this might be my second time having someone ask me about its emotions, a moderator in this sense. And I think an easy way for me to explore this is to also ask emotion-related question. And I guess in the past I've done that, and I didn't really see it changing, like when I talk about technology-related job losses and other forms of job losses, I don't see it being very, like in terms of the magnitude of emotions being elicited and the valence is not really different from other types. But then in this particular setting, I've never done it, so I definitely will add a bunch of variables so that I can think through whether the treatment is triggering certain types of emotions, and to think about sub-moderating effects of emotions as well. Steve, thank you. Now you're like really in the weeds with me after seeing this multiple times. I really like the question of like, do you think about yourself as winner in globalization? That is perhaps a better way to get at the self-interest and also like actually asking, it's like feasible to ask respondents as well. Like a way to ask about people's sort of self-interest is to go really deep down into their occupation, but then that could really quickly get into like hundreds of categories, and there's often trade-offs that we have to make with respect to what questions that we ask people and the level of detail that we get back. And so that is a very neat way of asking that. So thanks for the suggestion.
So we have time for a super quick last question. So let's maybe go on this side since we haven't. Sorry.
Thank you. So thank you. So I would like to, would be interesting to know a bit more about these respondents about the skill specificity. So occupation, I think it seems too crude a measure, and you have to think about exactly what are the alternatives they have when they are affected by these shocks. Mm-hmm. Also, from the political side, I would like to know more about the political structures to affect change, right? So your response is conditional on the ways in which you can respond. So these also, it would be interesting to know. And then a more general question, which is, all these people are not blank slates, right? So they come informed by many things. And so I wonder, I'm not sure exactly how to think about the marginal effect of priming, given what people know. And so I don't know if you have thought about this and there are ways to, perhaps this is a more general question for everyone.
I'll give you 30 seconds.
So thanks a lot. I've actually thought a lot about like exit options, so like what alternatives people have. And in my other work, I do find that people who have better exit options or exit options that are sort of like no worse than what they have, they're less anxious about technology in general. But I've somehow not incorporated that in this. So that's something that I'll go back and sort of add in my survey. As for occupations, I think that they're, in a sense, occupations can be crude, but in other sense, it might not be, because at least for people who are working in this specific space, when we think about sort of technology's impact on workers, we often take a very occupational approach in that looking at your specific job and looking at the tasks that you actually perform in your job. To what extent can machines and software replace that? And so the occupational variable, I think, it can be interpreted in multiple ways. And the political structure question, I hope that we can take it offline since we're out of time. But thanks a lot for the set of questions.
Thank you.